Ernesto Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. Two leaders, two legacies, one revolution. Guevara was a visionary who wished to lead a global communist revolution and aid the people in military rebellion. Castro wanted to build a successful country and use his political power to deliver hope to an oppressed nation. Their complementary military and political leadership allowed them to ignite a successful revolution in Cuba and make drastic social and political reform. These contrasting styles of leadership sparked the Cuban Revolution and allowed them to create lasting individual legacies. Cuba had been a Spanish colony since Columbus had landed there in 1492. The colony eventually developed ties with the United States, which strengthened when Cuba became independent in 1868. Many nations were concerned that the U.S. had too much power over the island, but these worries were soon put to rest in 1940, when the U.S. chose to support Batista's democratically elected government. Many Cubans were unhappy with the way they were being treated by Batista's government. In 1952, he went from president to dictator and became notorious for his infringement upon basic liberties, especially the freedom of speech. The Cuban people tired of the oppression, but those who spoke out against him were silenced and imprisoned.
President coup was accomplished in only 77 minutes, but Cuba's political freedom is ended as Batista cancels the June 1st elections. Batista says he is a friend of the people as his soldiers patrol the streets to establish what he calls disciplined democracy.
Fidel Castro, a young Cuban law student, saw Batista's abuse of power and decided he needed to take action. His powerful gift of persuasion helped him stand out from other rebellious student leaders. He quickly gained popularity with the oppressed Cubans. Seeing his leverage over the public, the Cuban government was forced to either imprison him or face revolt. Castro was imprisoned and eventually fled Cuba, heading to Mexico, where he met someone whose shared vision would help him set his revolution in motion. Ernesto Guevara was an Argentine who wanted to help others by becoming a doctor. During medical school, he and a friend decided they wanted to see the world. After a motorcycle trip in which he witnessed the suffering of the people of Latin America, Guevara was outraged by all types of oppressive governments.
For Che, it was about social change and justice. A revolutionary fights to change the whole structure of society at once, not some gradual change.
The last stop on his journey was in Mexico, where he was introduced to a young Fidel Castro. When he heard Castro's story and plan for revolution, he knew they could together overthrow Fulgencio Batista and change Cuba forever. Guevara and Castro set off for Cuba, but immediately ran into problems. Batista heard that revolution was stirring. The revolutionaries were nearly caught as they came ashore in their small yacht, the Granma. A portion of the group escaped to the mountains and began preparations for their revolution. Guevara's skill as a strong military leader helped keep his men together. His organized attacks allowed for greater strategic positions. His knowledge from medical school was crucial to survival in the mountain terrain, where injuries and accidents were common. In contrast, Castro's confident and charismatic personality was thrilling to the public. When in the mountains, it was Castro who initiated contact with potential recruits. Castro was acknowledged as the primary leader of the revolution and expected to take over the new government. While Castro's persona was loved and celebrated by people throughout Cuba, Guevara's role was not overlooked. They both knew that a successful revolution wasn't possible, also it was supported by both the military and public, and together they led the revolution to success.
Bearing 26th of July banners, joyous followers of Fidel Castro sweep triumphantly through the Cuban capital hours after their rebellion had toppled the regime of Fulgencio Batista.
To stop the corruption and to put an end to the abuse and oppression, that was what Che prioritized.
While the dynamics of their different leadership styles were vital for the revolution's success, they also led to conflicts that couldn't be resolved. Shortly after the end of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Cuba formed an alliance with the Soviet Union because Castro knew that Cuba needed trade and protection from a superpower to survive. Because of many similar ideologies, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union. This angered the U.S. and bred mistrust between the United States and Cuba. The relations weakened until in 1961, they became openly hostile with the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was the major turning point in the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. and between the two leadership styles of Castro and Guevara. Castro was willing to work with the Soviets in exchange for protection and trade. The Soviets desired Cuba's strategic position near the U.S. Guevara saw the Soviet Union as an example of a misled revolution where Marxism had been compromised. In order to avoid conflict, Castro sent Guevara to China, a strategy repeated by Castro whenever Guevara's policies became inconvenient for Castro's Cuba. This symbolized the end of the revolution and the start of a process of nation-building. Castro's relationship with Guevara began to dissolve, as Guevara's unrealistic view on politics separated him from Castro's desire to gain allies. Guevara hated the idea of working with the Soviet Union and lacked the administrative talent necessary to help build a nation.
Che Guevara single-handedly went about destroying the Cuban economy. First, as head of the central bank, he nationalized all the banks, therefore wrecking the system of banking and credit in Cuba. He then, as head of the agrarian reform process, nationalized almost all the land, such that even today there is less production in agriculture in Cuba than there was in 1958. Cubans they produce less rice, they produce less tobacco, they produce less coffee than they did back in the 50s. And then when he was Minister of Industry, he nationalized almost all industry, and Cuban industry today is largely bankrupt.
Because of this, Castro sent Guevara on missions outside of Cuba, so he would be out of the way while Castro established a bond with the Soviets. Tired of being shipped off, Guevara soon began leaving on his own revolutionary missions and died in a failed coup in Bolivia. Guevara's martyr-like death catapulted him to instant fame and established his international legacy. The global and national perspective of Guevara remains constant as an idealist fighting against an oppressive administration, his image emblazoned on revolutionary posters and t-shirts. Guevara was one man, fighting against what he perceived as the main problem of the world, capitalism. This reflects his political ideals, inability to compromise, and shows why he was the symbol and identity of a revolution. Guevara's extreme ideals have led to distinct contrasts in his legacy. Some remember him as the savior of a nation. In the United States, however, Guevara is recognized as the revolutionary he is, but is viewed as lacking the political experience to make a significant difference in the Cuban government. Guevara's individual legacy as a symbol of revolution greatly contrasts with that of Castro's. Castro's legacy is that of a successful statesman who built the current government of Cuba from the ground. One aspect of Castro's legacy is its most recent development. Some argue that the United States' re-establishment of diplomatic ties with Cuba was only possible because younger generations don't know of his atrocities and older generations of Cuban immigrants are dying off.
The United States must not abandon the Cuban people by relaxing or lifting the trade embargo against the communist regime.
Despite this, Cubans are now attributing an improved economy to the last stages of Castro's legacy. In Cuba, Castro is seen as the father of their nation, a perception drawn from his strong political leadership. The U.S. and other countries have treated his Cuba as a dictatorship where calls for more human rights have gone unheeded.
For the same reason, 2 million other Cubans chose to leave Cuba, and for the same reason that Cuba would have been emptied totally of people, and people would have been completely free to leave with their property because of the imposition of communism. It happens in every country on earth where communism has been imposed. People try to leave. Think of Vietnam. Think of East Germany. It happens everywhere. It happened worse in Cuba because it was a very prosperous country prior to communism.
The contrasting leaderships of Che Guevara and Fidel Castro were necessary for the Cuban Revolution, but ultimately ended their relationship. Thanks to Guevara's military leadership and Castro's political leadership, the pair was able to overthrow an established government and form an independent nation. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara achieved their dreams for Cuba. Today, their actions continue to have an impact. Although the economy of the small nation has declined, in many ways it still resembles the vision Guevara and Castro shared. Recently, diplomatic ties have been reopened between Cuba and the U.S. While the effects of this on Cuba's political state are still unknown, it has the potential to end Castro's communist ideals and be the start of a new, more democratic Cuba. Without the leadership of Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara and their lasting legacies, Cuba and the world would be very different places.